The shift rotation ended at 0600, and Marcos was still under Conduit 7 when the boots stopped beside his head. He knew those boots. The left sole had a scuff along the heel from an old maglock accident, and the right had been resoled twice with different grade polymer, so it caught the light differently. He'd noticed that 11 years ago, in a different life, on a different world, and the noticing came back to him now the way old things do, quietly, without announcement, like something that had never actually left. "You're going to give yourself a neural bleed one day lying under that thing," said Martine. Marcos didn't move. He had 4 more sensor nodes to recalibrate before the Verath's morning inventory sweep, and each one was the size of his thumbnail and threaded through conduit housing that hadn't been properly accessed in 3 years. He needed another 40 seconds. He took them. Then he slid out, sat up, and looked at his old friend. Martine had aged the way people age when they've been eating well and sleeping in pressurized berths instead of colony-grade foam. The lines around his eyes were there, but they were fine lines, the kind that came from squinting at screens rather than the deeper grooves that came from squinting at dust storms and thinking about how to make the air recycler last another 2 months. He was carrying a transit pack, Colony Authority insignia on the shoulder, and he looked slightly too clean to be standing in sub-level 4. "Communications reassignment," Martine said. "I know. I saw the manifest 3 days ago. You didn't send word." Marcos looked at the conduit housing, then at the toolkit spread across the floor beside him. He began reassembling it with the same deliberate economy of motion that had kept him alive down here for 11 years. "Nothing wasted, nothing rushed. I figured you'd find me. Took me 40 minutes. You've moved."
They reorganized subsection C after the cave-in.
Martine crouched down, which meant he was going to stay a while, which was the thing about Martine that had never changed. He committed to a conversation the same way he committed to everything, completely and without visible calculation, so that you never quite knew if he'd decided to care, or if caring was simply the state he defaulted to. "How bad was the cave-in?" "Bad enough." Marcos closed the toolkit case. "How long is the reassignment?" "Indeterminate." Colony authorities being vague, which means the contract with the Verath is being renegotiated, and they want someone on site who can run both human and Verath communications protocols without making a political incident. Martine glanced around the low-ceilinged space, at the piping and conduit and the faint amber glow of the mineral extraction vents running along the south wall. "I didn't want to come back. I know, but I couldn't stop thinking about this place." "I know that too." The amber glow pulsed once, the 30-second warning before the automated systems kicked into their morning cycle. Both men stood, Marcos moving first, heading for the service hatch without looking back. He knew Martine would follow. That had also never changed. They ate in the secondary canteen on level 2, where the ventilation worked and the colony workers went when they didn't want to be seen by authority supervisors. The food was the same it had always been. Reconstituted grain protein, synthetic coffee that smelled almost right, vitamin supplements they called candy because calling them candy had been someone's joke once, and now it was just what they were called. Martine ate with the careful attention of someone rediscovering a flavor they'd been trying to reconstruct from memory. "You still working maintenance?" he asked. "Officially." Martine looked at him. "I'm officially a senior conduit technician, class 3, responsible for the integrity of extraction infrastructure in subsections B through F." Marcos drank his coffee. "It's a good title, and unofficially." The canteen was half empty at this hour. The 2 workers closest to them were deep in a card game and not paying attention. The ventilation hummed its familiar low note. Marcos had spent 2 years listening to conversations in this room before he'd understood how to speak quietly enough that the ventilation would carry his voice away from everything except the person directly across from him. "You remember the Voss experiment," he said. Martine went still in the particular way that meant he was accessing a memory that had some weight to it. The Voss experiment had been a theoretical exercise in their 3rd year of colony prep school, back on Earth, back when they were both 17, and the idea of living on an extraction colony was still abstract enough to be interesting. Their teacher, a dry, pessimistic man named Ferreira, who'd actually done a posting on Meridian Station, had given them a thought problem. If you understood how an alien species perceived time, what could you do with that understanding? Martine had written a paper arguing you could use it for diplomatic advantage. Marcos had written a paper arguing you could use it as a weapon. Ferreira had given Martine a higher grade. "I remember," Martine said. I've been working on it for 3 years. The silence that followed was the kind that had texture. Marcos watched his old friend turn that over, feeling the weight of it, testing the edges. Martine had always been the one who thought before speaking, who assembled sentences in his head before releasing them into the world, who had the gift for communication precisely because he understood that words did things and you were responsible for what they did. It had made him good at his work. It had made conversations with him occasionally exhausting. Marcos had missed it. The Verith experienced time non-sequentially, Martine said finally. He wasn't asking. Their neural architecture perceives temporal events in probabilistic clusters rather than linear sequence. What we experience as past, present, future, they experience as a kind of weighted probability field. They know what has happened and what is likely to happen with roughly equal clarity. The distinction between memory and anticipation is almost meaningless to them, which is why they're so effective at resource management and why they're almost completely blind to grief. Martine put down his fork. They cannot model it, Marcos said. They've studied us for 60 years. They understand that we experience emotional weight around past events. They understand the cognitive dimensions. What they cannot do, what their architecture literally will not allow, is generate that state themselves, which means they cannot simulate it, which means they cannot predict behavior that originates from it. He paused. Do you know what that means for their security modeling? It means, Martine said slowly, that any action motivated by grief falls outside their predictive envelope completely. Their systems flag it as anomalous and defer to probability matrices that assume rational self-interest. They cannot conceive of someone doing something because of a person who is already dead. Neither of them said Lucas's name. They had not said Lucas's name in 11 years, not since the first labor uprising. Not since the Verith response that lasted 9 days and ended with 43 colony workers dead and a new set of compliance protocols that the colony authority called the new framework and that everyone else called the cage. Lucas had been 26. He had been the kind of person who laughed before the joke was finished because he could already see where it was going. He had been the third person in what had been a 3-person plan that had now, for 11 years, been a 2-person secret. Martine looked at the synthetic coffee in his cup for a long moment. What does the device do? Harmonic disruption. The Verith's neural architecture is sensitive to specific frequency ranges. It's how their hive coordination works. A focused resonance pulse at the right frequency doesn't kill them. It doesn't even hurt them exactly. It disrupts their temporal perception for approximately 30 minutes, collapsing the probability field into strict sequential present tense. They experience time the way we do. That sounds almost gentle. For 30 minutes, their entire coordination network goes dark. Their predictive systems fail. Their security models revert to baseline reactive. Any command issued during that window takes 4 to 6 times as long to execute because they're suddenly experiencing causality in order, one thing at a time, and they have no framework for operating that way. Marcos met his friend's eyes. We'd have 30 minutes in which we could move the colony workers through the extraction tunnels to the emergency evacuation ships that have been sitting unused in Dock 7 since the new framework grounded them. And then we'd be gone before the 30 minutes ended. Marcos. Martine's voice was careful. The colony authority is not our friend. You know this. You've known this for 11 years. Knowing it and acting on it are different things. I know. Marcos picked up his fork, put it down again. But I've been lying under Conduit 7 for 3 years, building a resonance emitter from scavenged parts. And I've got it to the point where it will work. But I need someone who can synchronize its signal output with the colony's primary communications array. Because the array is the only transmitter powerful enough to push the frequency through the Verith network hub. And I need that person to do it without colony authority knowing what's in the signal. The card game at the other table had ended. One of the workers was sleeping with his head on his arms. The other had left. The ventilation hummed. You need me, Martine said. I've needed you for 3 years. You're here now. It was not the most elegant thing anyone had ever said to rekindle a friendship, but it was honest, and between the two of them honesty had always mattered more than elegance. Martine looked at his food for a while. Then he looked at the wall. Then he looked at Marcos, and Marcos recognized the look. It was the same one he'd worn at 17 when he was about to argue with a conclusion he'd already accepted. Show me what you've built, he said. Marcos showed him. The device lived in a sealed casing inside the secondary pump housing for extraction vent 6, which had been listed as offline for maintenance since Marcos had filed the first of a series of carefully spaced repair requests that had collectively created the impression of a stubbornly persistent hydraulic fault. The casing was the size of a transit locker. The device inside it was not what anyone would expect to find there, and it was also not what anyone would expect to work. Being built from conduit regulators and atmospheric sensors, and 3 components Marx had sourced from decommissioned Verith scanning equipment, which he'd acquired through a process he described to Martine as creative procurement, and which Martine described, accurately, as theft. But it was beautiful in the way that things built over years with patient love tend to be beautiful. Not pretty, not elegant, but precise. Every component chosen, every connection deliberate. Martine crouched in front of it the way he'd crouched in the sub-level corridor, committing himself to looking at it, and Marcos watched him the way you watch someone meeting something important. The frequency calibration, Martine said after a while. That's the part I need you for. The array output will drift unless someone's correcting it in real time, and the drift window is about 4 seconds before the signal degrades below threshold. 4 seconds is tight. I know. 4 seconds is very tight, Marcos, I know, but you were always faster than me at signal correction. Martine made a sound that was almost a laugh. You remember that? You were faster at a lot of things. Marcos looked at the device. I was always better at lying under things. They worked through the next weeks with the disciplined ordinariness of people who had grown up learning to hide what they were doing in plain sight. Martine performed his official functions with the kind of careful competence that earned him access without raising suspicion. He was genuinely excellent at his job, and the colony authority was pleased with his work, and the Verith coordinator assigned to the station found him appropriately deferential. Meanwhile, in the hours between shifts, in the secondary canteen, and the pump housing, and the long access corridors of subsections B through F, they talked. They talked the way they had at 17. When talking had felt like building something. They talked about the other people they'd grown up with, who had left the colony, who had stayed, who had changed, who had turned out to be exactly who they'd seemed to be. Martine had kept in touch with more people than Marcos. He had, over the 11 years, maintained the relationships that Marcos had let go quiet, and he described those people to Marcos with the careful specificity of someone who understood that information about the people you love is a gift. Marcos's younger sister, Luciana, had gotten off the colony 4 years ago. She was living on Meridian Station. She'd learned to skate on ice, actual planetary ice, apparently, on one of the outer moons, and she'd sent Marcos a video of it once that he'd watched so many times the file had begun to degrade. He mentioned this to Martine almost in passing, and Martine said nothing for a moment, and then said, I know. She sent me one, too. And the fact that Marcos's sister and his oldest friend had been sending each other things across the void while he lay under conduit housings in the dark felt like something too tender to name directly, so he didn't name it. Marcos told him about the Verith coordinator assigned to their section, being the colony workers, called the accountant, not as a nickname but as a genuine functional description. The Verith had no individual identities in the human sense. They coordinated through shared probabilistic modeling, and each coordinator was essentially a localized node of the larger network, running assessments of colony output and reporting deviations. The accountant had been assigned to this section for 4 years. In that time, it had issued 17 disciplinary notations, overseen 3 infrastructure modifications, and attended 6 of the biannual compliance meetings in person, or in whatever passed for person, given that it traveled inside a translucent mobile unit about the size of a compact cargo crate, filled with the iridescent fluid in which its bilateral neural clusters floated. It communicated via a translation device that had been calibrated to produce a voice that sounded like a patient schoolteacher, which Marcos had always found more unsettling than any growl or screech would have been. Does it watch you? Martine asked. It watches everything. That's its function. But it watches statistically, not individually. It's looking for deviation from expected productivity curves. As long as the numbers come in right, I'm invisible to it. And you've kept the numbers right. For 11 years. Martine shook his head slowly. Not in disbelief, but in the way you shake your head at something that is both impressive and slightly horrifying. You've been maintaining full output metrics in subsections B through F while also building an illegal resonance weapon in a pump housing. Senior Conduit Technician, Class 3, Marcos said. In school, you could barely keep your locker organized. I had different motivations then. This was the thing about talking to Martine. It had the quality of excavation. Not therapy, not confession, just the ordinary archaeology of two people who had known each other before they became who they were, and who therefore had access to the layers underneath the current version. Marcos had spent 11 years becoming someone who was efficient and contained and careful, and Martine could see through all of it to the person who used to leave his gym kit in the science lab and argue passionately about things he was wrong about and laugh too loudly at his own jokes. That person was still in there. It was odd to have someone around who could see him. There was also the actor, Maxie, who had been involved in the original plan before Lucas died. An extravagant, unreliable man who had agreed to help move workers through the tunnels on the night of any action, and who had then spent 11 years getting more extravagant and more unreliable, while somehow remaining stubbornly available. Marcos had not told him about the device. Martine, after a week, said, "We need Maxie. Maxie talks too much. Maxie knows every tunnel in this colony that we don't, and he knows which workers we can trust." Once told the entire second shift about a medical procedure he was having in enough detail that 3 people filed psychological distress reports. That's also true. Martine paused. "We still need him," Maxie, when told, cried. Not from fear. He made this clear, speaking slightly too loudly for the ventilation to fully mask, but from what he called the culmination of a long-deferred commitment, which was his way of saying he had been waiting for 11 years and was relieved the waiting was ending. He was also, as Martine had said, indispensable. He had spent 11 years mapping the tunnel network the way some people spent their lives cataloging something beautiful, with a completeness that went past utility into devotion, and his maps were the difference between a route that worked and a route that worked, and got 400 people to Dock 7 in 22 minutes. But first he wanted to argue. The 3 of them met in the tunnels beneath subsection E 2 weeks before the action, because tunnels were the one place where the Vareth surveillance architecture had genuine gaps. Their sensor network had been designed for extraction monitoring, optimized for detecting mineral density variations, and while it could detect human presence, it could not effectively distinguish purposeful gathering from workers sheltering during a pressure event. You just had to go deep enough into the sections that hadn't seen maintenance in years, where the lighting was sparse and the air had that particular metallic quality that meant you were far from the recyclers. Maxie's objection, delivered in the rapid, slightly theatrical manner that was simply how he talked, was this. The resonance pulse would disrupt the Vareth network hub, yes, but the accountant's mobile unit had an independent power cell that operated on a closed-loop system. The pulse might not reach it. It will reach it, Marcos said. The closed-loop shielding is designed to protect the power cell, not the neural clusters. The frequency I'm using bypasses the power cell entirely. It acts directly on the neural architecture. You're certain? I'm certain. Maxie looked at Martine. Is he certain, or does he just sound certain? He's been working on this for 3 years, Martine said. People can work on something for 3 years and still be wrong. They can, Marcos said. I'm not. How do you know? Because I've been studying the Vareth's neural architecture documentation for the last 4 years, because Colony Authority maintains a technical library for administrative personnel that contains full Vareth physiological specs, because the frequency range I'm using is derived from those specs, and because I've cross-referenced it against 6 independent research papers published through the Meridian Station Science Network that all confirm the same sensitivity window. He paused. Also because I took one of the decommissioned Vareth scanners apart to confirm the construction of the closed-loop shielding and verify that it only covers the power systems. Maxie stared at him. The scanner is the creative procurement Martine mentioned, Marcos added. Another silence. Then Maxie said, You broke into a decommissioned Vareth unit. I borrowed components from one. That's Marcos. If they had found you, they didn't find me, but if they Maxie... Marcos's voice was quiet. Lucas is dead. 42 other people are dead. The new framework has been in place for 11 years. I have been lying under conduit housings in this colony for 11 years, and I would like to stop doing that. And I would like 400 people to come with me when I do. So yes, I broke into a decommissioned Vareth unit. I would do it again. The tunnel was very still. Somewhere deeper, water was moving through a pipe, the slow, patient sound of infrastructure doing its work. Maxie had known Lucas, too. He had been the one, on the night of the first uprising, to carry him back through the tunnels. He didn't talk about that. He had never talked about it. But it was in the way he went quiet now, and in the way he looked at the tunnel floor for a long moment, and in the way he finally said, "My route takes 22 minutes from signal to dock at standard pace. 18 if we push. 22 is fine," Martin said. "I'll need 12 people staged in advance. I have staging points at 3 junctions. I've been using them for years for storage. Colony Authority thinks they're supply caches." He pulled out a data pad and began talking through the route, and the argument was over, which was the thing about Maxi. He argued like he was performing it, loudly and with full commitment, and then he stopped and moved on completely, no residual resentment. No secondary opinions offered later in quiet. It was, Marcos thought, a surprisingly efficient way to operate. Afterward, walking back through the tunnels, Martin said, "He was right that it was a risk. The scanner. I know, I'm not criticizing. I'm saying you made a considered decision about acceptable risk. I did. So did Lucas." Martin walked for a moment in silence. "That's not a comparison meant to go anywhere. I'm just thinking out loud. I know. I think about him differently now than I did before I came back. I'd built him into something in my memory. Coming here made him smaller again, which is actually better," Marcos said. "Yes, better. Smaller and more real." Martin looked at the overhead piping. He was afraid that night. You remember that? I remember. He was terrified. He kept making jokes, which is what he did when he was terrified. 3 jokes a minute, escalating ridiculousness. A pause. And then he went anyway, which is the thing I keep coming back to. Marcos nodded. He knew the thing Martin was coming back to. He had been coming back to it for 11 years himself, lying under conduit housings in the amber light, turning it over. Not the tragedy of it. He had moved through the tragedy, slowly, the way you move through something that has weight, and come out the other side into something quieter and more useful. What he came back to was the simple fact of it. A person who was afraid had gone anyway, and that fact had both ended something and begun something, and the thing it had begun was still in motion. They were the motion. Marco stopped walking. They were at the junction of the tunnel that led to subsection E, and the one that led to the secondary canteen, and there was a low amber light at the junction point, and Martin stopped when he stopped. And for a moment they just stood in the quiet passage on a colony on a brown planet at the edge of a distant system, 2 30-something men who had been great friends once and were finding out that the word once didn't mean as much as they'd thought. "I'm glad you came back," Marco said. "I know you said you needed me. I needed you before I needed your skills." A pause. "That's what I meant." Martin looked at him for a moment. Then the coin appeared in his hand, from nowhere, as it always did, and he made it vanish again, and he said, "I know that too." The night before the action, Marcos went alone to the section of Conduit 7 that ran closest to where the cave-in had been. He didn't bring anything. He didn't say anything. He stood in the amber-lit passage for a few minutes and felt the weight of the place the way you feel the weight of somewhere you've spent a long time. Not unpleasant, but substantial. The accumulated density of years. Then he went back. Martin was waiting at the secondary pump housing. He'd been running calibration checks for the last 4 hours, the kind of meticulous, iterative checking that didn't mean he didn't trust the device, but meant he trusted it more with each pass. There were coffee cups, and he'd brought 2 of them, the synthetic kind that smelled almost right. "Ready?" Marco said. "No." Martin handed him a coffee. "Are you no?" "Good." Martin looked at the device. "Scared people make better decisions than confident people. I read that somewhere." That sounds like something Ferreira would have said. Ferreira would have said the opposite. He liked confidence. Martin drank his coffee. I think he was wrong about a lot of things. The action began at 0342, which was the deepest point of the Verith coordinator's rest cycle and the peak of their predictive system's reliance on probabilistic modeling rather than active surveillance. Maxi had moved 12 people into position in the tunnels over the previous 6 hours, each movement timed to a maintenance rotation, each person briefed in the compressed, matter-of-fact way you brief people when the information needs to stay in their bodies rather than just their heads. Every worker in the colony had, over years, been quietly told that if they ever heard a specific frequency tone on the emergency band, they should move to Tunnel Nexus C and follow the route markers, and not wait. Marcos was in the pump housing. Martin was at the communications array terminal, 40 meters away. wired to Marcos through a line that looked like a standard diagnostic cable, and which Colony Authority had not bothered to trace because Colony Authority had never, in 11 years, seen a reason to trace a diagnostic cable. The device came online smoothly. It had never been tested at full power. There was a version of this moment in which that mattered enormously, and a version in which it didn't. And Marcos had spent 3 years deciding which version he was living in, and he had come to believe, not with certainty, but with the stubborn conviction of someone who has put enough time into a thing to know its character, that the device was sound. He activated it. The tone that went through the colony emergency band lasted 0.4 seconds and sounded like nothing significant to human ears. To the Vareth network hub, it was the equivalent of all clocks stopping simultaneously. The drift began 2 seconds later, as predicted. Marcos could feel it in the signal output, the way you feel a car beginning to pull on a long road. Not yet a problem, but the beginning of the direction toward one. Through the diagnostic cable, Martine was already correcting. 4 seconds. The frequency held. 8 seconds. Maxie's voice came through a standard comm unit in Marcos's pocket. Very quiet. They're moving. 12 seconds. Martine's corrections had a rhythm to them now, a human rhythm. The small, constant adjustments of someone who is very good at a thing and knows it without having to think about it. Marcos listened to it the way you listen to a piece of music that's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. 18 seconds. Somewhere in the colony, 400 people were moving through tunnels. 23 seconds. The signal spiked, a fluctuation in the array output, something in the power system's baseline. And Marcos felt the drift begin to accelerate. And through the cable, he felt Martine feel it too, and he thought, this is it. This is the part where it fails. This is where 3 years of work under conduit housing resolves itself into a Tuesday morning disaster. And then Martine made 3 corrections in about 2 seconds, and the frequency locked and held. How? Marcos said, out loud, not really expecting an answer. Through the cable, nothing. But he could feel the signal, still there, still holding, still doing the one thing it needed to do. 29 seconds. The dock was a kilometer away. Maxie had said 22 minutes. That was with the routes he knew. 22 minutes was nothing, under normal conditions, but nothing about these conditions was normal. And Marcos stood in the pump housing with his hand on the device, and his eyes on the signal readout. And he thought about Lucas, who would have been standing here with them, who had been 26 and could see the end of a joke before it arrived, who had wanted, more than either of them, to get people out. 30 seconds. He held the signal for another 90. Then he shut it down. In the silence after, the pump housing felt very still. Marcos heard footsteps in the corridor. Martine, moving fast but not running, because running drew attention. And then Martine was in the housing doorway, looking slightly more disheveled than he'd looked an hour ago. Coffee gone, cable trailing from his wrist. It held, Marcos said. It held. The correction at 23 seconds, I know. I felt it. I don't want to talk about it right now. Marcos nodded. He began the process of cycling down the device, a 30-second sequence of shutoffs that, at the end, would leave the pump housing looking like a pump housing with a faulty hydraulic component. The casing would stay. The device would be dismantled in the morning, piece by piece, returned to the places it had come from, a long, slow undoing of 3 years of building. The colony workers are in the tunnels, Martine said. Maxie said 22 minutes to the dock. How long before the Vareth system restores? 28 minutes from shutdown. Maybe 30. That's fine. That's enough. It was enough. They both knew it was enough. But they stood in the pump housing anyway, in the amber-lit quiet, and waited. Marcos thought about a conversation they'd had in the second week, in the secondary canteen, late in a shift rotation when the synthetic coffee was gone, and they'd been talking for 3 hours about everything except what they were planning. Martine had done a small magic trick, sleight of hand, a coin that vanished and reappeared, and Marcos had watched it with the same attention he gave to everything, and had said, "How did you learn that?" "I've always done it. Since school." "You don't remember?" "I remember you doing it. I didn't know you'd kept it up." "Some things," Martine had said, making the coin disappear again, "you just keep doing. Not because they're useful, because they're yours." The dock authorization came through on Marco's comm unit at 0406. Maxie's voice, "Dock 7. All present. Loading commenced. A pause. All present." He'd said it twice, which was the code they'd agreed on, which meant no one had been left behind. Marcos exhaled. Martine was looking at the wall with the expression of someone doing internal mathematics, calculating something that wasn't numbers. Then he said, I filed a communications anomaly report 4 hours ago. A test pulse that accidentally propagated to the wrong frequency range. It's fully documented. Colony Authority will see it and decide whether to investigate, but by the time they do, the ships will be gone. Yes, Martine, yes, thank you. The pause that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was the pause of two people who have known each other long enough that they don't need to fill every silence, who have spent an important night together in a space that smelled of machine oil and synthetic coffee, and the particular flat note smell of a colony that has been running too long, and who are standing in the aftermath of something that cannot be undone, which is its own kind of relief. There are 2 more ships in Dock 7, Martine said eventually. I know. One is on the manifest for Colony Authority personnel. The other is unassigned. Marcos began carrying the dismantled device casing toward the wall panel that opened to the maintenance crawl space. He did it with the same economy of motion, nothing wasted, nothing rushed. Then he stopped, with the panel half open, and looked back at his friend. It's a long transit to Meridian Station, he said. Martine picked up the toolkit from the floor. He looked at it for a moment, then at Marcos, and the lines around his eyes were the same lines they'd always been. Fine lines from squinting at screens, except that something in his face had opened slightly, the way a room opens when you remove something that had been blocking the window. Your sister, Martine said, is going to be very annoying about this. She's going to say she knew all along. She did know. She told me 3 years ago that you were probably building something down here. How did she? Because she knows you. Martine handed him the toolkit. Come on. We have about 19 minutes. They moved through the access corridor toward Dock 7 without hurrying. The colony was quiet at this hour. Not the quiet of absence, but the quiet of something that has just changed, the particular hush that settles over a place in the gap between what it was and what it will be. The amber lighting in the service passages gave everything the same warm, slightly worn quality it had always had, and Marcos walked through it the way he always walked through it, by feel, by the knowledge of where every junction was, and which pipe hummed at which frequency, and what the ventilation system sounded like when the pressure was right. He had spent 11 years learning to love this place the way you learn to love a thing that has also been your capricin, because it was the truth of where he was, and pretending otherwise would have cost him more than he was willing to pay. He had learned to love it, and now he was leaving it, and both of those facts were true simultaneously, and neither of them canceled the other. At the junction of subsection D and the main transit corridor, where there was a scuff on the floor from the maglock accident 11 years ago, Martine made the coin appear from behind Marcos's ear. Marcos didn't break stride. Still yours, he said. Still yours, Martine agreed. They walked into the dock. The ships were loading. 400 people moving with the quick, organized urgency of people who had been told exactly where to go and had believed, when the moment came, that they should go there. Maxie was at the dock entrance with a tablet, checking names, and he looked up when he saw them, and his expression did something complicated. Relief and grief, and a kind of triumphant hilarity that was entirely characteristic. 21 minutes 40, he said. I said 22. You said 22, Marcos agreed. I was conservative. Maxie looked at the tablet, then back at them. Both ships? Both ships, Martine said. Maxie nodded. He made a note on the tablet. Then he said, without looking up, he would have loved this. Nobody said the name. Nobody needed to. The thing about grief. The thing the Vareth could not model. The thing that made it a weapon and a wound simultaneously was that it did not require naming to be present. It was there in the way Maxia said he without specifying, in the way Marcos and Martine both knew immediately who was meant, in the shared weight that moved through the 3 of them in the space of a breath, and was gone, because the ships were loading and there was no time, and the best tribute you could pay to someone who died trying to free 400 people was to free them. The dock doors were open. Marcos was the last one through them. He looked back once, from the threshold, at the amber lighting, at the pipes and conduit, at the 400 people around him, moving toward the ships with the momentum of a decision that had already been made, at Martine, who was ahead of him, already helping someone with a bag, already useful, already working. Then he stepped through, and the door closed, and the ships began to move. Outside the colony, past the dock seals, the mineral extraction planet was the same muted brown it had always been, faintly lit by its distant sun, enormous and indifferent in the particular way that planets are indifferent. The kind of place where you could spend 11 years and it would not notice you, which was, Marcos thought, also a form of freedom. To be in a place that doesn't watch you, even if the watching is done by the systems inside it. The Verith Network Hub would be coming back online in approximately 6 minutes. By then, they would be in transit. Colony Authority would see Martine's anomaly report and flag it, and there would be an investigation that would find a pump housing with a faulty hydraulic component and a dismantled casing that told them less than they wanted to know. The new framework would remain in place for whatever colony came next, and that was a problem that belonged to a different day. Today belonged to 400 people on 2 ships moving away from a brown planet in the direction of Meridian Station. Today belonged to Maxie, who was already telling someone a story too loudly. Today belonged to Martine, who was at a window in the far berth, looking out at the planet with an expression that Marcos couldn't read from this distance, but recognized anyway, the expression of someone in the process of leaving, which is different from the expression of someone who has left. And today belonged, quietly, to the one who wasn't there, to the pieces of the plan that had come before all the other pieces, the one who had believed first, who had been 26 and too young, and who had made the whole thing possible simply by showing them that it needed to be done. Marcos found a seat near a porthole. He sat with his toolkit on his knees. He was tired in the deep, specific way that comes after years of careful work, a tiredness that was also completion, a heaviness that had some lightness in it. Outside, the planet was already growing smaller. He thought about his sister, skating on actual ice, on a moon he'd never seen. He thought about the video file he'd watched until it degraded. He thought about how she'd known, 11 years ago, that this day was possible, and had been right. He thought about a paper he'd written at 17, arguing that understanding how an alien species perceived time could be used as a weapon, and how Ferreira had given him a lower grade. He thought Ferreira had been wrong, not just about the grade, about confidence too. The planet shrank behind them, and Marco sat with his toolkit and looked out, and after a while Martine came and sat beside him, and neither of them said anything for a long time, which was fine. They had never needed to fill every silence. It was one of the things that had survived 11 years, and the cave-in, and Lucas, and the amber-lit passages of a colony on a brown planet at the edge of a system that neither of them had ever chosen. The silence survived, and so did they. The ships moved on.